Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our networking event, Transforming the Path to Resilient Infrastructure for Sustainable Urban Development. I'm Masaki Nakagawa, Executive Director of Asian Disaster Reduction Center, ADRC. It is my great pleasure to be here as your moderator for today's event. So, we'd like to start the session with the opening remarks by the Government of Japan, the organizer of this event, Mr. Yoshinobu Fukazawa, advisor to the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, the long name of the Government of Japan, will give you initial remarks with some backdrops of this topic. Yes. Mr. Fukazawa, please.
I don't need this. Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our network event towards achieving the SDGs and realizing the new urban agenda through the spatial planning platform, transforming the path to resilient infrastructure for sustainable urban development. I'm Yoshinobu Fukazawa, advisor to the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism of Japan. It is my pleasure to be here with you all, and I thank the government of Poland and the city of Katowice for hosting this 11th session of the World Urban Forum. With more than half of the world population living in urban areas amid the acceleration of the urbanization worldwide, it is essential to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Goal 11 of making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. The implementation of the new urban agenda indeed contributes to achieving this goal. With this in mind, at the 9th session of the World Urban Forum, Japan declared its firm commitment to contributing to the 2030 agenda as well as the new urban agenda, in close cooperation with UN member states, UN Habitat, and all other parties concerned. As part of translating that commitment into tangible action, Japan and UN Habitat jointly established the Spatial Planning Platform (SPP) in 2018, aiming at creating a network for sharing knowledge and peer-to-peer learnings on spatial planning. At the 4th SPP meeting, held in February this year, on an online basis, we discussed disaster risk reduction for resilient society, as well as sustainable urban life through smart regions. Based on the outcome of this SPP meeting, this session will take a deeper dive to discussing the essential element of building resilient society with a focus on resilient infrastructure. Rapid economic development and urbanization require massive investment that can be a good opportunity for governments and stakeholders to mitigate the impact of future risks by building resilient infrastructure for sustainable urban development. We are now at the crossroad of whether or not we can build a resilient society, and I recognize that it is crucial to deepen the understanding on resilient infrastructure. Today, we have invited distinguished speakers from the World Bank, OECD, JICA, who have extensive knowledge in this field. While the last two SPP meetings were held on an online basis due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are truly happy to hold this meeting finally in this real-time way. I look forward to having fruitful and lively discussions, and thus deepening our cooperative relationships. With that, I conclude my welcoming remark, and I thank you all.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Fukazawa. And as Mr. Fukazawa mentioned, the expected huge investment will be an opportunity for making society resilient. But there still are many challenges ahead of us to implement it. So, as Mr. Fukazawa emphasized, we are at a crossroads whether we will make a society resilient or not. And that's why we will discuss resilient infrastructure today. Okay, so but before getting into substantive talks, let me introduce today's wonderful speakers. From the left, next to Mr. Fukasawa, Dr. Same Warba, Regional Director, Sustainable Development, Europe and Central Asia, World Bank. Dr. Warba holds a PhD in urban planning from Harvard University and has 25 years experience in urban development, land, housing, disaster risk management, infrastructure, and sustainable development. And prior to the current position, Dr. Warba serves as a Global Director, Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience, and Land Global Practice, which also covers territorial development, geospatial, and result-based financing issues. And next to Dr. Warba from OECD, on behalf of Dr. Purimi, we have two speakers here. Ms. Yuhara Asako, who currently promotes quality infrastructure in developing countries at OECD Development Center. Ms. Yuhara was previously in charge of water infrastructure management and development in Japan. And one more person from OECD is Dr. Vicente Ruiz, economist in the Economic Transformation and Development Division. Dr. Ruiz supports local and national authorities in less developed regions through policy advice on urban and rural development strategies. And from Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, Mr. Yamashita Nozomu, Director of Office of Peace Building, Governance and Peace Building Department. Mr. Yamashita has served key positions related to disaster response and disaster risk reduction in JICA, including being a part of the Japanese delegation negotiating the Sendai Framework. And Mr. Yamashita also has experience serving the permanent mission of Japan to the United Nations and the Ministry of Defense of the Government of Japan, which allows him to bring his rich experience encompassing development, diplomacy, and defense to the table. Right, so with four excellent speakers, we are talking about resilient infrastructure today. But this topic has recently been widely discussed, and I believe most of us have already understood that resilient infrastructure is essential to achieve sustainable urban growth. But the question is how we can implement it. In other words, how we can translate our understanding to practice. So therefore, this event will focus on, can you see? This event will focus on the opportunities and the challenges of promoting resilient infrastructure and explore pathways for sustainable urban development. This is the objective of this event. And a number of points need to be discussed for this purpose. These are just examples, but first, understanding of resilient infrastructure. What does resilient infrastructure mean? And what are the essentials of building resilient infrastructure? This is a starting point of discussion. And second, economic dividend. What are the economic benefits of resilient infrastructure will provide to the region? And third, implementation approaches. What are the essential sets of risk knowledge and capacities that cities must develop to identify risks in order to implement resilient infrastructure projects? And of course, this topic includes some constructive and non-constructive measures, of course. And next, please. Yes, the financing. How to finance a resilient infrastructure? What is the cost-effective approach of building a resilient infrastructure? And this is the biggest challenge ahead of us, and we will discuss later. And next, exemplary practices. How do some cities design and implement their respective resilient infrastructure strategies? How to scale up exemplary practices of building a resilient infrastructure to other cities in the region? And residual challenges, of course. So, of course, these are not all. Speakers may present more perspectives, but we will try to discuss the implementation of resilient infrastructure from as many different perspectives as possible within a limited time frame, so that we can find a way to implement it effectively and efficiently with limited resources. Okay, so this is a 90 minutes event, so without further ado, let me welcome our first speaker. We will start with a presentation from OECD, Ms. Yuhara. Ms. Yuhara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So today I would like to present about the planning and implementing resilient infrastructure in urban systems, our initial reflections. I'm Asako Ihara, OECD Development Center. So, bridging infrastructure divides is paramount for development. So, we provide the targeted advice to developing countries to improve their planning, financing, and implementation of infrastructure policies. Then, we collect good practice on infrastructure planning, also financing and implementation, also looking at the role of development cooperation in supporting infrastructure in developing countries. So we do so by leveraging the inclusive membership of the OECD Development Center and its policy dialogues. Our membership is open for both OECD and non-OECD countries, including many Asian, African, and Latin American countries, including also Europe. Then I think many of you already know about these principles, but I just recall today's session's title. The International Committee calls for resilient infrastructure and for enhancing the role of cities in sustainable development. As SDG Goal 9 mentioned about build resilient infrastructure to promote sustainable industrialization and innovation. And SDG Goal 11 is making cities and human settlement inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Also, it mentions about climate resilient infrastructure. Then, new urban agenda shows we commit ourselves to strengthening the resilience of cities and human settlement, including through the development of quality infrastructure and spatial planning. It continues, it's a very long one. Then the G20 QII principle for is building resilience against natural disasters and other risks. Then, so what is QII principle is also, I hope many of you already know, but G20 principle for quality infrastructure investment has 6 main principles. It is principle 4 clearly mentioned about resilience, but other principles are also relate a lot of about resilient infrastructure. Principle 4, each infrastructure should be resilient to natural disaster and other risks. But principle 2 is also mentioning rising economic efficiency in view of life cycle cost. It means actually the importance of operation and maintenance. I will recall this later. And also QII principles are not limited into infrastructure, the resilience of infrastructure itself. Principle 1 is maximizing the positive impact of infrastructure for sustainable development, which relates to enhance resilience of economy and society and also cities. Also, it means being consistent with national and local development strategies. I think it relates the concept of quality infrastructure in new urban agenda. So, infrastructure which satisfy QII principles could be resilient infrastructure. Then how to put these principles into practice? I wanted to mention about 3 points. So first one is what resilient infrastructure means in the urban context. So it is ability to absorb shocks and continue functioning, such as electricity grid has a backup to continue functioning and built-in redundancy for internet infrastructure. And I also, Mr. Fukazawa mentioned, I remind the one example which discussed, which presented by Sendai City at Spatial Planning Platform meeting this year. They present the example of wastewater facilities without electricity running from their experience of tsunami and earthquake. Then the second is capacity to ensure continuity of critical urban services such as healthcare, schools, mobility, and water, including also wastewater management. And capacity to serve and include the forest and avoid them being disproportionately affected by shocks. And also it is ability to plan future-proof infrastructure. For example, infrastructure for the energy transition considering both climate change and future. But also another example would be upgrading existing infrastructure can be also good example. Upgrading dam infrastructure can increase discharge capacity of dams for hydropower and flood risk management, considering future risk, in particular caused by climate change. Then second is key enablers, means what is the key to enhance infrastructure resilience. The comprehensive long-term urban planning in coordination with national plan process in advance rather than ad hoc build-up infrastructure. It relates to QII principle 1. The second factor in resilience in the pre-risk project assessment, such as geological climate surveys. It's directly related to QII principle 4. Then following 3 points relates to QII principle 2, necessity of considering of life cycle cost, and also suggested in G20 policy agenda on infrastructure maintenance endorsed last year. Ensuring financing for infrastructure maintenance. Then develop strategic preventive maintenance capacity is also key. Strategic preventive maintenance needs the infrastructure facilities plan for life extension, which aims to improve their before they deteriorate. This reduces of life cycle cost by reducing future maintenance and renewal costs. And also with that, mobilize cutting-edge technology to ensure resilience. For example, using big data, artificial intelligence, and also robot camera and inspection using infrared rail survey will be also helpful for appropriate operation and maintenance. I think infrastructure does not end when construction is completed. It can be called a resilient infrastructure unless it is used and maintained in the future. So then the final one is accommodate vulnerable communities as critical users and beneficiaries. It relates to QII principle 5. Then the third one is mobilize partners and resources. Mobilize adequate domestic and international financing for resilient infrastructure for urban systems in developing countries. Just G7 leaders announced that they will launch G7 partnership for global infrastructure. It was just last week, I think. Then the second is support domestic and international city-to-city partnerships for knowledge sharing is also important. Then explore innovative financial option is also important part. When we discussed with Colombia government, the U.S. Department explained their Build America Bureau, which could be one of the examples. They presented our member their approach for supporting transportation infrastructure development projects in the U.S. by streamlining credit opportunity and grants and provides access to the credit and grant programs, which also providing technical assistance and encouraging innovative best practice in project planning, financing, delivery, and monitoring. Then investing in capability at the urban level to plan, manage, and implement resilient infrastructure is the second one. Then related to these about partners, on this December from 6 to 7, we Development Center will have high-level meeting of the OECD Initiative for Policy Dialogue on Global Value Chain Production Transformation and Development. During this meeting, we will plan to have joint session with Emirates on infrastructure resilience to natural disaster. We hope many, if you can come to Azores Island, Portugal, we want to invite you and we'll have more discussion about this resilient infrastructure. Then here is a part of our work. You can find more resources. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mizuhara. I see when we discuss resilient infrastructure, it is very important to ensure a common understanding of the definition and its impact on the society and economy. So it is a good starting point for us to consider G20 principles and other definitions and some concrete examples of building resilient infrastructure which help with that understanding. And also she pointed out that the importance of maintenance considering its life cycle cost and incorporating resilient infrastructure into some planning, urban planning, city planning. So we should think it as a broader perspective. So I thank again Ms. Hara. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Yamashita from JICA to see resilient infrastructure from the perspective of disaster risk reduction. Okay, Mr. Yamashita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Nakagawa, for inviting me. And I would first of all like to thank Mr. Fukasawa for convening this very important event. Also, I would like to thank my fellow panelists as well as the distinguished guest participants that is present in the room. And I guess this has been online streamlining. So for all those participants that watching this, thank you very much for sharing your time, and good afternoon from Katowice. So I will be presenting my presentation according to this title. By the way, my name is Nozomu Yamashita. I'm the Director for Office of Peace Building at Japan International Cooperation Agency, which might seem a little bit strange to discuss infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, or disaster risk management. However, I was part of the disaster risk reduction team in JICA before that, so I will kind of put on that capacity to speak today. Of course, JICA itself is an organization that aspires a peaceful, free, peaceful, prosperous, and resilient world. And at this moment, my office, Peace Building Office, is very much into this grain crisis issue. So my heart is kind of half occupied in that situation, how we cope with that. However, I would like to focus my today's presentation in disaster risk reduction. So let me start my presentation. So briefly, what I will be talking about today, I would like to, as Yuhara-san presented, OECD presented its framework with SDGs and UA. However, I will try to frame my presentation according to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which kind of is a very guiding principle for our international cooperation activities that we focus on building DRR infrastructure. So I would like to, my presentation will be covering the Sendai framework for DRR, disaster risk reduction, and why we think focusing on resilient infrastructure is important, our disaster risk reduction cooperation strategy, and some hint for transforming the path to resilient infrastructure, envisioning an inclusively protected social system or a space that leaves no one behind, which is very much connected to our SDG goals that we all aspire to. So just a quick recap of the Sendai Framework for Action. It has 4 priorities: understanding the risk, strengthening disaster risk governance, investing in disaster risk reduction or resilience, and build back better after we are hit by disasters. So for this presentation, I would like to be focusing on the priority 3 of the Sendai Framework for Action, which is to invest more on disaster risk reduction. So just some of you may be aware, some of you may not, so just a quick explanation of how the Sendai Framework for Action. We have 7 targets that we kind of want to achieve until 2030. And as you can see, those targets are all correlated: reducing the mortality, reducing the affected people by disasters, reducing the damage to critical infrastructure, reducing economic losses. And we think, or JICA thinks, that damage to critical infrastructure, how we focus on this specific target, we have come up with some strategies to cope with this. So what we mean by critical infrastructure, it's defined by one of those expert working group of the UN, physical structure, facility, network, and other assets which provide service that are essential to the social and economic functioning of the community or society. So when we think about, when we discuss infrastructure, we must make clear what types of infrastructure we are talking about, and what infrastructure to prioritize. So first one, disaster risk DRR infrastructure, which protect inclusively space from disaster, like river embankment, which protects the area from floods. And most important infrastructure, which lead and maintain society, like the Prime Minister's office function, disaster risk reduction agencies function, police stations, maybe fire stations, etc. So I think protecting those infrastructures or those networks is also very much important when we talk about DRR infrastructure. And also an important infrastructure which maintains society's life to survival, like the lifeline, main roads, hospitals, fire stations. Those are also very much important. And also infrastructure which can be the emergency shelter, like a public schools and city halls. I will be coming back to this 4th one later in my presentation. So due to urbanization or rapid development, we see that overall long-term trend, the disaster fatalities is, sometimes up, sometimes down, but overall it's decreasing. Affected peoples are, sometimes up, down, but it's decreasing. However, due to the concentration of people in urban areas, we see that the economic loss is increasing compared to those fatalities and affected peoples. So we need to focus our measures according to this trend. How we do about this? Sorry. And also for developing countries, the most impacted or the biggest risk factor of disaster is the flood. Of course, earthquakes are big. Once they hit, it causes catastrophic damage. However, flood is a kind of a recurring damage that, especially in the Asia, Indo-Pacific monsoon area, flood is one of the biggest issues that we need to tackle. So based on this, I would like to quickly introduce how we are, or JICA is confronting this issue with our international cooperation. is that we think that the Japanese experience itself can serve as one reference to how we deal with this issue of disaster risk reduction. For instance, in Japan, we have been coping with a lot of disasters, especially flood was one of the biggest issues. So from the pre-modern area, we have been installing flood control measures, and it has been even pre-war, after war, and now we have been accumulating these measures up until now. So we kind of divide the phases of status of disaster risk reduction in three kind of phases. First one is the early DRR phase. This is kind of the beginning of the country society to realize that they need to invest in disaster risk reduction. And then DRR acceleration phase. This is the phase when the assets for preventing disasters kind of accumulate. And then the developed phase. So I think Japan, although we are still, hit by natural disasters, we think that we are in a developed phase. And we think that most countries, I will be specifically mentioning about the Philippines later. However, in an early DRR phase or the acceleration phase, that we think we can kind of work together with them on this issue. And for JICA, three main pillars for DR cooperation is to strengthen the overall DR governance. That's number one. Number two is to gradually augment structural measures, invest in DRR infrastructure is our second pillar. And the third pillar is once when when a country is hit by disasters, we promote Build Back Better. So I think today's forum it's mainly about resilient infrastructures. That kind of goes in line with our second pillar to invest in structural measures. Just a very quick recap of the Japanese experience, just to show that our JICA's experience or how we deal with international cooperation is very much rooted in how Japan went through this, S-curve of this disaster risk reduction or becoming a resilient country. So after World War II, now 75 years since the war, 75 years ago, it was like this. Everything was, flattened. I think this is quite heartbreaking when we see the images from Mariupol, or it's basically, the same thing that we kind of went through 75 years ago, our parents or our grandparents. However, we started from the situation like this. And after that, we have been investing in disaster prevention. 5 to 8% of our overall national budget. And as you can see here, this is kind of the percentage and the amount of the allocation according to the Cabinet Office. The Japanese Cabinet Office. So with this accumulation of the measures, structural measures for decades and decades, you can see we were able successfully to reduce the number of fatalities by floods, areas of inundated areas, quite significantly. So it shows that these investments has this kind of an effect in the society. So focusing on floods, how we wait a minute. I think this is not. Maybe this is not showing the visuals in the right proper manner. However, this was to kind of present that we have this. Maybe how can I present this? Maybe wait a minute. Maybe the next slide can help. Oh no, it doesn't. So this is kind of showing this land area with a residential area and a river, and it kind of shows that if you kind of leave it to the people to protect yourself, they'll be kind of making these embankments by themselves, which doesn't really protect the space itself. So we're kind of advocating that the central government needs to install the river embankment, needs to like reservoirs, invest in reservoirs, levees. Sorry, I should have, checked, but yeah. So this is kind of an image that we think that there's this role by the central government to really invest in these DRR infrastructures. Maybe afterwards I'll give the right version of the slide so that people can see what I was talking about. And we think that with the public investing in flood measurement is kind of a path to an inclusively protected space or area, which I think is very key to the resilient urban areas. So I hope the earthquake one works, but let's see. So yes, for earthquakes, what do we mean by earthquake measures? What do we mean by trying to be inclusive? There are a lot of people that advocate for evacuations or disaster education. That's fine. People need to be aware of that. However, investing real currency in retrofitting, I think, structures is very much important. That's quite hard, but you can't just say that you need to evacuate those people to schools where the school structure itself is vulnerable. It's not retrofitted. So actually this is a video actually embedded here. I don't know how to. Can you show the video? No? Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this so when we advocate for evacuations to schools, if the schools are like this, it's going to be creating more damages or more situations unfavorable for protecting the people. So we need to invest in making the structure resilient, strong, that can stand these earthquakes. And I think schools, hospitals, governmental buildings, these are public investments that the decision by the government can do. Of course, private housing is another issue, but that's another priority that needs to be considered and I will touch upon that later on. So how we do this? This is the case in Japan. We have a lot of earthquakes. However, we think that we have built a resilient structure. So even a mega earthquake happens, can you go on with the, yeah. At least the structure doesn't collapse. I think that's most important, and that's where we need to invest in. Structures that doesn't collapse and can withstand these earthquakes. Yeah, so I'll just go on. Yeah. So in order to do this, what the Japanese government is doing is we're kind of doing a full-scale modeling of structures. We have heavily invested in this, and can you show that? Yeah. So how to make these resilient structure is quite an investment, but it is, according to our understanding, the worth investment that we should be, undertaking. I'll just go on to the next slide. Yeah. So for elementary schools, let's say, since 2002, we have been, strategically investing in retrofitting our elementary schools because we think that elementary school is a structure which accommodates those evacuated people. So it needs to be a strong structure. So ever since then, I think for the past 20 years, we have come to a point that almost 100% of the elementary schools are very much retrofitted. The blue figure, blue line shows the percentage of the elementary schools that has been retrofitted. And the yellow shows the remaining school structures to be retrofitted. So you can see there is this commitment by the Japanese government to really build this resilient figure. So we think this kind of a social system. It seems that the slide isn't really working according to my preference, but I'll just show that we need to, what this slide shows is that we think that we need to prioritize where to focus as the whole social system. And I think the first layer of our focus is to invest in DRR infrastructure, government complexes, main hospitals, police buildings. Second layer, lifeline, main road, school transportation, government service, supply chain. Third layer, schools, local businesses, livelihood, facilities. And the fourth layer, private houses. So prioritizing this to maintain a social system even after the disaster is, I think, quite important. So, this is an urban forum. People are from the urban planning field. So how we plan these important facilities spatially is quite important. So, yeah. So the Sendai framework for DRR kind of is target is 2030, and we are. It has been divided to two phases. One phase is the planning phase, or the getting the national target strategy until 2020, and then now we are at the implementation phase. And so the Japanese government committed 2 times until 2015 to 18. We committed ourselves to train DRR officials, 40,000 of them, and to invest in $4 billion US dollar support, mostly in a form of loans. And we have achieved that, as you can see here. And now we are in the second phase of our support cooperation, committing further to support more trainings of DRR officials and more investments in DRR infrastructures. So last, I would just like to touch upon our very strategic partner, the Philippines. The Philippines, we are kind of neighbors. The President Duterte called the Japan partner that's more close than brothers. So we are very close, and we have been building very good relationship. And as everybody knows, the Duterte administration committed to the Build initiative. And as you can see here, this is the budget for DPWH, Department for Public Works and Highways. And the red figure is the flood control, infrastructure measures. And as you can see, there is a significant increase of flood control measures in this administration, which we highly commend, and we very much enjoy working with them. We have invested quite heavily on the Pasig Marikina River. This is kind of the river that flows in Metro Manila, and this is the Mangahan floodway, which we have been investing quite heavily on. And I think, when was it? In 2020, there was this Typhoon Undai, and we kind of made a projection. There was a damage, of course. There was this damage of 2 billion, and people were affected. However, if though the same damage was calculated without those flood control measures, $13 billion of losses have been we estimated would have been occurred, and estimated of 1 million people have been affected. So with these flood measures, it's kind of a testimony that it really saves lives, it really saves infrastructure, it really saves economic losses. So for JICA, we are focusing our activities to the implementation of the infrastructure, and we're working very much closely with our partner countries. So this is my last slide. Sorry to kind of keep you going, but what's the most important thing about promoting the investment? And we think that political leadership is most important, and I would like to end by kind of putting forward this figure. This is the East Japan earthquake in Hanamaki City 10 years ago and now. So as you can see, we aspire for a resilient world as well as a free and peaceful and prosperous world. So thank you very much, and I look forward for the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Yamashita. I see that Mr. Yamashita presents the importance of investing in resilient infrastructure by the government from the public sector to increase predictable and social systems. So if we can let the people protect by themselves, maybe rich people can do that, but that's not what we are aiming for. And Mr. Yamashita also provided concrete examples of how resilient infrastructure are working, and noted that the most important factor in their implementation is political leadership. All right. Then finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Samiwaba from World Bank to hear a comprehensive viewpoint and the most important issue we need to tackle. Dr. Waba, floor is yours.
Thank you, Nakagawa-san, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me present to you the results of a study that we've done at the World Bank called Lifelines, about the resilient infrastructure opportunity. And of course, infrastructure, we all know the value of infrastructure in our lives. It's critical in terms of our basic needs, whether it's water, electricity, urban mobility, but it's also critical for private sector development, for jobs, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we know that infrastructure is subject to two key pressures. The first is that rapid urbanization is increasing the demand pressures, in terms of things like traffic congestion, pollution, and of course, planning and service delivery cannot keep up. And the second pressure is that natural shocks, basically extreme weather events, seismic risk, etc., are not only damaging the infrastructure assets, but they cause widespread disruptions to our lives. So we've done this in this study, this Lifeline study, basically an annual damage and repair cost assessment globally. We've looked at two hazards, basically floods and cyclones and earthquakes, etc. And we noticed that two of them are particularly omnipresent. I mean, one is flooding, which is the most prevalent, if you will, source of hazard, and of course, and what we've seen is that the damages can be extensive. I mean, we're talking here $30 billion as an estimate in 1 year, of which $18 billion in low and middle income countries. But damages is just the tip of the iceberg. It's economic losses that's the major problem we're talking about over here. So we're talking at the cost in terms of economic losses for households and for private sector firms are at least $400 billion. It's basically things like interrupted productions, like lost inventories, additional costs, labor-based issues, etc. So these figures, when we put a $400 billion figure, I don't know what it means, but these images start showing you what it means. So this is Haiti. When infrastructure breaks down, like in this particular case, basically the population has to queue up to get water. There's waterborne diseases, cholera, etc. This is Thailand. When urban roads are flooded, people cannot get to jobs, cannot get to work, cannot get to services. Everything is disrupted. This is basically a power cut in any place in the world you'd like to imagine. And basically it means that children can no longer study. It means that economic activities are stopped. Firms are no longer able to operate. And moreover, exposure is increasing rapidly. So, as you've seen, basically on the one hand, our analysis, this is an example from a city in Vietnam, Quang Nam, and what you see that, on the left-hand side picture, you look at basically the flood-prone area, and you'll notice it was undeveloped. But as urbanization pressures are increasing, you'll notice that basically development has reached, those embankments, and therefore the increased exposure takes place because of urbanization. So, how do we achieve resilient infrastructure? We've heard about the quality infrastructure investment, the QII principles, and here, for us, the menu comprises of those 5 basic steps. One, you need to get the basics right. That's building codes, regulations, putting in place the procurement system, and of course, ensuring that operation and maintenance of infrastructure is put in place and thinking about the financing. The second is the institutions. Basically, it does not work to have a government entity by government entity trying to solve the problem. You need a whole of government approach. And at the same time, you need to ensure that you have systems in place to ensure equitable access, so that we remedy the situation of the haves versus the have-nots in terms of disaster reduction. Then, it's a combination of regulations, but also the incentives for resilience. So we need to have those incentives in place for service providers to be able to offer resilient infrastructure assets, services, and so on. Of course, we have to improve the decision-making processes, so that's both planning and decision-making, so that's why we do the decision-making under uncertainty type of analytics. And lastly, of course, we need the financing to translate the planning and the decision-making into action on the ground. So, one example, Lima, Peru, looking at the transport system and when it floods in Lima, Peru, to what extent can the population access healthcare facilities? So by looking at it's a criticality analysis so that we can ensure that under conditions of disasters, in this particular case flooding, certain critical services, those lifelines that were just mentioned, are accessible. This is Vietnam, and we've done modeling of the flood exposure to critical infrastructure systems. In this particular case, it's the power plants and the substations. To look that in the context of a flood at different levels of exposure, you've got the graphs showing the 25-year return period, the 50-year, the 100-year, and the 200-year, the percentage of the power system that gets basically disrupted. Again, very important in decision making to help improve the resilience of the power network to ensure continuity, because when you don't have power, you don't basically, your water purification system is not working, your sewage treatment system is not working, you cannot even access money in an ATM machine, you don't have production. You can imagine the consequences of not having power. Now also in Vietnam we've looked at the energy sector, but here with using different type of analytics, and this is satellite data that makes it really cheap to identify the risks and to take some pragmatic decisions for action. So here we've mapped the transmission and distribution network, and we analyze its exposure to storm and cyclone risks. So altogether, that kind of analytics that we do is really critical to inform decision making. We're talking about, and this is the economic case for investing in resilience. $1 invested in resilient infrastructure leads to at least $4 of net benefits, in terms of avoided economic losses, etc. So we're talking about, if you put that infrastructure to high standards, to quality infrastructure standards, we're talking about a $4.2 trillion potential net benefit. But also we're talking about the cost of doing nothing. If you don't do something, we're talking about an estimated $100 billion a year of cost of that delayed action of investing in resilience. So this study, Lifelines, which you can find on the World Bank website, is basically making the economic case for investing in resilience. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Warba. And I see Dr. Warba gave us a rich evidence-based case studies and statistics showing the gaps and challenges of the current implementation of resilient infrastructure, and also a set of action to address them. Right? Okay, so now we have had all presentations, and based on all points raised so far, we will take a deeper dive on discussing pathways for sustainable urban development through building a resilient infrastructure in this part. So in this discussion part, I would like to hear each speaker's perspective on some common questions. The first question is, please, Kate. The first question is how to finance resilient infrastructure, and what is a cost-effective approach of building a resilient infrastructure. So when my organization, Asian Disaster Reduction Center, asked its member countries about the challenges in implementing a resilient infrastructure, lack of financing was the biggest response. And this is followed by human resources, lack of governance, and insufficient data, etc. But in several other surveys, lack of financing is always mentioned as an issue to build resilient infrastructure. So although some solutions have been presented in the presentation, I'd like to ask all speakers again about your views on this. Okay, so may I start with OECD?
Yeah, thank you. When we discussed our member countries of development center, these questions are often asked. I think today's presentation of all of us, I think, try to answer these questions. Then I just recall that understand the importance of resilient infrastructure and also mobilize adequate domestic and international financing for resilient infrastructure. Maybe for that global partners can help part of it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jaika, Yamashita-san, if you have something?
Yes, very shortly, as Mike presented already, I think political leadership is key, and I think there is already cases that governments, especially developing country partner governments, are realizing this. As I presented, Philippine case is a very significant case, and as our World Bank colleague presented, there is this economic case to make this political decision. So very much would like to underline the importance of political decisions. And if such decisions are made, we JICA are very much always eager to work and invest in those critical infrastructure projects. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so Dr. Barber, you are especially a specialist on this issue, I think.
Thank you. So, basically, strengthening the resilience of infrastructure, its payoff is avoided losses. So, the case for investing in it is not very straightforward. It's basically you invest to avoid getting damaged. So, obviously, the best timing for this is, to make the case for it is after a country has undergone, unfortunately, a particularly devastating event, it becomes evident to invest in this. So, at the World Bank, we have a financing mechanism which is a budget support or a line of credit that's available to a country to be activated when a disaster strikes, so that they do not have to go and cannibalize the funds for health and education and other services. But in return, to have this line of credit there, they would need to invest in risk reduction and risk preparedness. So it's basically the country invests in climate proofing its infrastructure, in preparing itself with hydromet systems, with early warning systems, so that they can reduce the potential impact and better prepare, and in return have this line of financing available. So that's one way that the World Bank does it. But of course, as part of risk finance in general, there's different ways. There's, normally there's budget support, so you'd expect the government to start availing funding to invest, both in terms of climate proofing its infrastructure, disaster proofing its infrastructure, but also dealing with, the small scale recurrent events. And then having, other forms of risk transfer, basically insurances, etc., and having these types of line of credit. So you need a portfolio of financial solutions with which to be able to finance resilient infrastructure in order to realize those uninterrupted production and, those avoided losses. One last thing, in urban areas, there is a particular dividend to investing in resilience, because if you, for instance, put the hardware that reduces the flooding risk of a given area, you increase the development potential of that area. You can build more development on it, and therefore you could put in place conceivably a land value capture mechanism that could basically bring back some of the proceeds of this improved urbanization to finance part of the cost of that infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. And thank you very much for your valuable comments. This is the biggest challenge we need to overcome to achieve the goal. So those comments are today's very important takeaways, I think. And allow me to just mention 2 points briefly on this. First, when considering financial resources, we will have to divide our infrastructure into 2 types. One is infrastructure directly related to safety, such as dams and levees and government headquarters, as Jaika mentioned. This type of infrastructure needs to be built with government funds, of course. And the other type of infrastructure that generates revenue, such as roads and electricity or lifelines, and World Bank mentioned. And such infrastructure needs to attract private capital to cover the cost and cost of construction and management. And second, infrastructure costs need to be considered not only construction but also life cycle costs, as the OECD mentioned, including management and renewal. So quality infrastructure is cost effective in this respect. Of course, increasing the quality of all infrastructure will increase tremendous costs. So it is also important to consider the quality of infrastructure according to its level of importance, rather than making everything of high quality. Right? Okay, so we move on to the next question. The second one, yes. We have learned some solutions to implement resilient infrastructure from both the public and the private sectors. And as presented, most of these solutions to build resilient infrastructure promote sustainable growth, reduce poverty, and improve people's lives. And in view of this, the second question is, how can we scale up those measures and build on the momentum? And what is the main role of the international organizations to achieve this goal? Okay, so this time may I start with, World Bank continue. So Dr. Barber, if you have something, please.
So the issue of scaling up is really the most complex one, and I think the best way to carry out scaling up is, as I mentioned, you need a whole of government approach, but you need different levels of government to operate together. So putting in place, for instance, an incentive system that could get local governments to invest in resilience, whether in the form of matching grants by national government, that if a local government invests $1 in resilience, the national government will match it by $1. Putting in place targets, to enable creativity and innovation in the solution, I think is one way to try to influence these systems. Now, the other way is to start thinking about types of infrastructure that are a bit maybe, so for instance, we always talk that infrastructure, is a combination of gray and green infrastructure. Oftentimes we look for, hardware type solutions, gray infrastructure, maybe thinking also about the software type solutions, building regulations, building codes, nature-based solutions, for instance, to reduce flooding, etc. These types of solutions can perhaps, help in the scaling up. Now, what is the main role of international organizations? I mean, an entity like the World Bank has 2 main roles. One is sharing global knowledge. I mean, we have a major program in Japan called the World Bank, the Japan World Bank Disaster Risk Management Program, where we learn from Japanese experience about how do you deal with disaster risk, how do you do disaster risk management, how do you do disaster risk reduction. We share that experience with the rest of the world. Also, we learn on the ground in one country, in another country, we carry that experience. We make sure, we help our different clients, exchange with each other. And all these ways are ways of sharing best practices, the lessons that have been learned. And of course, successful interventions, finding ways to replicate these types of interventions. It doesn't mean that we have, a full-fledged solution to scaling up and, but, these are steps that can go a long way. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, may I ask Jaika Yamashita-san if you have?
Very shortly, as our World Bank colleague said, governments tend to take drastic measures when they're hit by disasters, and I think that's quite unfortunate because it's learning the hard way. And I think the momentum should be that we need to kind of pre-invest in those DR measures. One of the momentums that I think is quite important, or the initiative, is that 2030 is approaching quite quickly. 2030 is the target year for Sendai framework for DRR, SDGs, etc. And it's not the end, right? And we need to kind of take stock of what needs to be further invested in, and what needs to be what couldn't have we achieved in this, 15 years or 20 years. So I think this international framework, kind of reimagining the international framework for sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, sustainable urban development after 2030, I think is one good momentum that we can, all work on. And it's not just about the UN, it's about, and not just about the World Bank, it's about our bilateral donor agencies like JICA, and of course partner countries on wanting a continuum of this kind of momentum even after 2030. So I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Thank you. And OECD, you have?
Thank you very much. Of course, I think that I have to echo the comment from a colleague from the World Bank, because I think that our role as well in the OECD is to share this knowledge. I think in particular when it comes to cities, we observe, and it's been widely discussed in this forum, the fact that many cities are just taking action, very innovative actions, and even going beyond certain targets set by national government. So there's a lot to learn from cities. In our case, what we try to do is to create platforms or policy dialogues where we can bring together different stakeholders to learn from this experience. And it's sometimes a very complex process, because whether we like it or not, sometimes local and national governments do not talk too much among each other. So this is also a great opportunity for us to bring these two parties together. For instance, we created a platform that feeds a discussion of G20, that brings also the notion of small and medium-sized cities. These are cities that sometimes are forgotten in the national development plans, and we believe that they have strong potential for development. So creating this platform to promote this dialogue and giving a space also for them to be heard, it's kind of a part of an important role. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is the main question. I'd like to ask also Mr. Fukazawa about his thoughts. Mr. Fukazawa, if you have something.
Thank you, and thank you very much for all the panelists for providing very important insights and inputs. And I just would like to bring in a slightly different perspective, which is a special, quote-unquote, resilient space, resilient territory. We've been discussing a lot about resilient infrastructure, roads and bridges, and the things and structures, which are, of course, very important, but the infrastructure cannot stand on its own. It is there to serve to creating resilient space in which people live and the socio-economic system functions. I think we can also discuss a little bit more about this issue from that perspective, which is resilient space and resilient territory. More specifically and more explicitly. That's my proposal. And of course, we have been hearing a lot about the keywords like the role of cities and integrating social consideration and integrating the environmental consideration, and the comprehensive long-term urban planning was mentioned very clearly, and the social system and space. Everybody, all the panelists do have this perspective in respective minds, of course, but probably the next session or next year or next urban forum, probably we could also touch upon that perspective. I think that's it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fukazawa. Thank you very much for all informative comments. Resilient infrastructure will not be built in one day, so we must keep working. And in this regard, I think international organizations play a major role in this direction. Unlike construction companies, of course, they are not only capable of efficiently constructing infrastructure, but also they can provide strategically integrating it into urban planning and other projects, and of managing it with good governance. So infrastructure development is a means, not an end itself. So it is important to think about incorporating it into broader goals, like Mr. Fukazawa mentioned, the space spatial strategy. Okay, so we move on to the next and perhaps the last question, the third question. What do you think are the remaining challenges in cities that need to be addressed to achieve their goals for resilient infrastructure, so resilient risks? Okay, so I'd like to ask Anyone who wants to? Okay, yes, Dr. Ruiz.
Thank you very much. I think I'm just going to be very brief because Dr. Wab already mentioned very critical aspects, and somehow he already addressed this question. I would just like to raise 3 points, and again, one was already mentioned, which was fast urbanization. I think that we've seen it in many regions, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, that cities are expanding very fast, urbanizing very fast, and this is creating a lot of problems in terms of the capacity for governments to supply services and manage a city and plan a city. What we observed that is creating in many cases issues in terms of adaptation, of course, that many populations now face higher risk, but also, I mean, it's a different discussion, but it's also setting the basis for many of these cities to be carbon locking, which it's a pending discussion in the agenda. My second point, it was already mentioned, but I think it's multi-level governance. I think that one of the big challenges is just to how we can manage to coordinate local and national agendas. I think that something interesting that happened during COVID is that because of the pandemic, many cities were forced to talk to national governments, and hopefully this created certain channels for further communication, but this is always an issue that it's pending. And my last point is a little bit more abstract, but what we observe many times in the field is that a big issue with mental models. What we observe is that many cities, many people, not just the cities, many people still think that the way to develop is following the same path as other cities done at large cities. And we have already observed the consequence of many decisions taken in this way. So what I mean by mental models, the idea of still depending on cars or building transport systems that focus on mobility rather than accessibility. And I stop here because we are running out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ruiz. Any other speakers who want to intervene? Okay.
I think it's a second plug at the point about the land value capture, that cities there's not going to be enough money from government nor from international development organizations to finance what's needed to basically strengthen resilience in cities. So cities will have to find, solutions to supplement their revenue. So investing in improving domestic revenue mobilization, improving their management of their assets, putting in place those investments that could create additional development rights, and finding ways to do a sharing of this additional valuation that gets created from urbanization with the beneficiaries. So it's the betterment levies, it's the transfer of development rights, it's all the methods that ex ante or ex post can generate a land value capture or land value sharing, as they call it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Yamashita.
Thank you very much. Actually, I don't have much to add. I think there is ample space for public investment in disaster risk reduction infrastructure. However, it needs to create some, I think, revenues, as the World Bank colleague is saying. So how we can do that, I think we need to, sit down and create innovative ways to, not just the public investment, but drawing in monies from the private sector is, I think, also important. And also a dialogue between the central government and the local government is also important, as our OECD colleagues said. So, yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are many, of course, issues that have not been resolved, but I think, fortunately, I believe that many of them have already identified. So we cannot solve all challenges at the same time, because the resolution of one issue often may create another issues. But I think sustainable development is about taking the right path one step by one step at a time without being hasty. Okay, so thank you very much for informative remarks and for sharing your expertise. Regardless of the question, do you have any further comments to share with us? It's okay? Okay?
Thank you.
All right, so it's time to close the meeting, and I'm sure that the meeting was really thought-provoking for us. And the closure of this event, it's of time? Just 2 minutes. Give me 2 minutes. Allow me to reflect for a moment on the meaning of resilience again. As you know, the word resilience comes from a Latin word which means to bounce back. But today, it is used in a broader sense in various fields, and in the field of DRR, disaster reduction, UNDRR defines it as, the ability of a system, community, or society at risk to resist, absorb, respond to, and recover from the effects of a crisis in a timely and efficient manner, etc. So, from a DR perspective, it is clear that resilience refers not only the ability to bounce back or to get back on track, but also to the idea of improving society in ways that makes it less vulnerable to the damage caused by disasters or any external shocks. So in other words, resilience is a society's ability to respond to crisis. So today, all of us are in a world of transformation, whether we want to be or not. From this perspective, resilient infrastructure is not something that resists external forces and maintains the status quo, but rather it is a critical change drive. So that's my conclusion in this session. Okay, so now it's time to close today's event. I'd like to thank all the speakers again and all participants. Okay, so stay safe and in good health until we meet up again. Thank you very much and goodbye now.